And recording is starting. All right. Well, welcome everybody. This is a panel sponsored by PFLAG Hartford and OurTransLife out of Bridgeport. We're glad to have you all here today. This is our Beyond the Binary. And we have three awesome panelists that are with us today. But before we begin, we're going to start off. I want to start off by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the territory of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Shattuck, Golden Hill Pagusset, Wangunk, and Nipmuc peoples who have stewarded this land through the generations. We thank them for their strength and their resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. Thank you for that. So now I want to introduce our three panelists today. We have gathered three non-binary panelists in celebration of International Non-Binary Day, which was on Sunday. And all of our panelists have very different identities in the non-binary spectrum, and I think this is going to make for a great conversation. So in your upper left corner, we have Bliss Kern. Bliss is a local advocate and works in support groups for queer and trans folks across the state. Then in your lower left corner, we have Iridescent Riffle, who uses she, they pronouns. Oh, Bliss uses hers pronouns. Iridescent uses she, they pronouns. Iridescent is from Kansas and is a non-binary trans femme from Lawrence, Kansas, where she serves on the Equality Kansas Board. And finally, we have Cass Meehan Marinich, who uses they, them pronouns from our locally, the Mohegan Tribe. And Cass is a non-binary two-spirit individual. And I'm so glad you were all going to be able to join us today. And what we're going to do is I'm going to start off with Bliss. I'm just going to rotate around and give everybody, 5 minutes to just kind of tell you a little bit about themselves and a little bit about their identities. So go ahead, Bliss.
Sure. Hi, folks. I'm so glad you could all be here. And I'm excited also to have met my panelists the other day, my co-panelists the other day. It was nice to have other folks around. Honestly, I have to say, I feel like an odd person to kick this off because although I work in advocacy, I just supported a group of people in celebrating International Non-Binary Day, along with Kim, who you can't see, who is our support today on the webinar. And Kim and I work together to get pride groups across the state to do international non-binary ice cream socials. And so this is obviously important to me, and yet it's sort of theoretical because as an agender person, gender is and has always been entirely irrelevant to me. It's something that's even hard to describe, pin down. It just doesn't really impact my life except for at moments where it's brought to my attention by external sort of pressures sometimes, although I don't always experience them that way. So essentially, like, as you might imagine, when I was about 4, this came up. And that was where I sort of started as like, and we can come back to that. Again, 12, 13, right? In kind of the puberty world, gender becomes very important to people. Having these conversations about gender, the intersection with sexuality becomes very important. And I'm like, And then we kind of go forward. And then around 22, 23, when people go through their university, I had great classes in queer studies that helped a lot to really ground things for me. And then around 22, 23, when people are like, what do I do after college? Oh, I start trying to make sure I'm meeting my life partner and I'm getting married. And I'm like, And so I'm loving watching Cass's face. Thanks, Cab. And then again, actually, this has recently come up in about the last decade for me, 5 years to a decade, sort of gradually more intensively in the sense of as gender diversity comes under attack, I feel like it's more kind of incumbent on all of us to have these conversations, to be more open, to reveal some parts of ourselves that we don't necessarily talk about, not because we're ashamed, but because like it's just part of who we are. But when you realize how many people just really have no idea and they're responding to rhetoric that is not based in reality, it does become important to have more of these kinds of conversations. And so that's why gender is back up and relevant to me. Again, it's an entirely, for me, external phenomenon. So, and just to like really frame this, because this is my age, I speak in memes and gifs, and I will say that to me, the thing that I most relate to is that amazing. I think he's the character from Shameless, and he goes, "Wait, are you telling me, are you telling me you guys blah blah?" And it's usually I think, "Wait, you're telling me you guys are getting paid for this?" And mine is, "Wait, you're telling me you have a gender?" And that's legitimately how I feel. Like I'm just like, what is this thing, this phenomenon? So for me, gender is literally just a lack of something, which is strange because it's a category that, like race and age, we use to identify people so quickly. And part of why I use the pronouns that I do, that's per, and pers, is because it just stands for person. And this is important to me because when you say she, her, or he, him, and even now in some ways, when you say they, them, there are starting to become assumptions that go on with these words. And what I like to say is, for every she that you say, 99 assumptions are coming out of your mouth. For every he that you add, another 99 assumptions are coming out of your mouth. And I'm going to tell you, of those 198 assumptions, about 3 might be right about me. And so why don't we all save some time and use my pronouns and kind of reflect on what that means and how we define each other through our language, through our pronouns, etc. So I didn't really have an option to talk much about agender, but I also don't want to take up too much time on the panel. So I'm going to pass that on to Erie, and we can get on to a little bit more down the road if folks have questions.
You did a great job. I appreciate it. Yeah. And I just realized I never actually introduced myself, so I'll go after Cass. I'll just give a quick intro, but well, all these technical issues at the beginning throw you off just a little bit. Iridescent, what's
Yeah.
going on?
Hi, my name's Iridescent. Typically go by Erie. I jokingly say it's a couple syllables shorter, so just do that. So hi, I'm not sure I can go for 5 minutes. When we did like a practice run, right? And I kind of just rambled for a while. So if I get to like a point where you're like, please stop me, like just let me know. So hi, I'm Erie. I'm originally from Kansas. I'm adopted, so I've seen like lots of rural Kansas and then grew up in the Kansas City area. A little bit about me is growing up, I knew that there was something just a little bit different about myself, especially after I was adopted. I kept having the reoccurring like thought of I don't want to be a boy. I didn't want to be born a boy. And then as I start, so thinking through that process, growing up, I would tell my parents, I grew up in a conservative household. And so my parents really didn't entertain that. However, it wasn't until when I started graduate school here at KU, I had become a teacher. I realized I wanted to be a teacher. That's what my degree from K-State was. And then I realized I want to work with college students, but I was also contemplating coming out and that process of coming out. And so that really influenced my decision to go to graduate school and to work in higher ed, as I had some fears and some reservations about working as someone who's openly non-binary and trans in a Kansas school, which is an unfortunate thing, I have to say. And there are plenty of wonderful friends that I have who are teachers who are out and are trans and are doing a wonderful job. So it was my first year of graduate school, and I had thought about coming out. I didn't know exactly how to go about that process. And I had a really close friend of mine in graduate school my first year that really helped me talk through that in a way that was not spoken in a binary, but also was me leading the conversation about how I feel, so I could come to these realizations about myself and really address them. And so after that, I'm here. I got my master's in higher education and student affairs, and I found myself pretty quickly after transitioning really needing to get involved in advocacy because we're starting to see some of this was about 2021. started to see some of those really bad anti-trans bills into the spring 2022. So I wrote to some legislators who had sponsored a bill, got a transphobic response back, which was awful, not surprising though. And so I decided I need to start testifying and start doing things like that. And so it was during my first testimony that I actually sat down right next to the Vice Chair of Equality Kansas. And they really helped me find some mentorship and ways to get involved in advocacy. And so I've really found a family through this work. I think I'm going to like stop there with my intro, but yeah, that's me.
Thanks, Erie. I'm glad to have some red state representation on here. We're over in Connecticut, we hear about you all like you're mythical, like we know you exist, but and it's it just makes it more personal, hearing that experience of feet on the ground. And along that vein, Cass.
Cha Nativis Cass. Hello, my name is Cass. I use they them pronouns. I grew up kind of experiencing the spectrum of like tomboy for a couple years and then like very feminine for a couple more years and like kind of flip-flopping back and forth. Discovered and like was very involved in theater for a lot of like late middle school, all throughout high school, realized that's what I wanted to do as a career. And like that and cosplay, discovering cosplay, I learned a lot about like presentation and like having a little bit more control of my like the way I'm perceived by others. But none of that clicked together gender-wise until college. My freshman year, I really started to experience my like actual like cognizant gender journey. And I like in discovering that I didn't really like fully resonate with being a woman or a man and like really discovering my like non-binariness and feeling comfiest with they them. Also became attached to Two-Spirit. And as I grew up closely involved in my culture. My mom worked with our tribe's cultural department, so I like grew up in the craft room and like was very hands-on with making my regalia as a kid, and just like with like learning who I was in that sense as like an Indigenous person, and having the label Two-Spirit was really something that not only spoke to me on like a cultural level of like gender as a role and as like a cultural part of myself, but also like helped me feel like more myself, especially while away from my community in like Philadelphia. And I happened to be in like art school in Center City, Philadelphia, in the theater world. So I had a very queer bubble of people to be around where it was very easy to explore my gender and also very easy to like generally have my pronouns respected. So it was a very nice, blissful couple of like 5 or 6 years in Philadelphia. But I now am back in Connecticut, and I am the arts and crafts specialist at the Mohegan Tribe. So it's kind of come very full circle for me, as growing up as a kid in the craft room and now running it. But I have the opportunity to not only help myself in like my journey with regalia and like expression culturally, but I get to help other people with that, ranging from like other trans people to also just like gender nonconforming cis people in our tribe. Like not everyone feels most themselves in a skirt of any kind, even a cultural one. So I get to help kind of combine my cultural background and my genderful background and experience with like other people, but also my costume design degree and skill sets of like sewing and creation and like designing clothes that people feel good in, to help all of this come together. So thank you. I'll stop there.
We'll get you talking some more. Let's start with an easy one, because we got three very different genders on here. When I said I was going to introduce myself real quick, my name is Lindsay Pasquale. I am the co-president of PFLAG Hartford, and I'm also the for PFLAG National, the regional director for the Northeast. So I help all our chapters across the 6 New England states network with each other, and trade different things that are going on that are doing well and not doing well, and work things out with national. It's really rewarding, and it's especially since I remember when I first joined PFLAG, what a mess I was, and it was and to just look back 10 years and say, well, geez, from being a mess to now actually being able to give back is kind of cool. But yeah, so the first question I want to give you all is, what is the one thing you feel that most don't understand about your gender? I'm not going to pick on anybody. You can raise a hand, but I know we have a trans feminine person, we have a two-spirit, and we have an agender. So there's a lot of people out there that have a lot of thoughts about those three identities. So what's the one thing you feel people really don't, most don't understand about it? Set the record straight. Erie.
I guess I'll physically hold up my hands. Because I'm like, oh, I don't want to go down to the bottom. I know I taught remotely and I should be better with Zoom, but this is easier.
I'm worried I'm going to log myself off.
So, so for me, like, I'm non-binary, right? But I fit more like mostly femme, and so that's where there's some. I think generally when thinking about non-binary, like being non-binary and not sitting in the binary spectrum, I think like there's a lot of confusing, or not sitting on the spectrum at all. I think the confusion that comes in for me, and that's why like I'm comfortable with she, they pronouns as well, is like I really thought about, okay, how do I feel, but also how does the world perceive me? How do I interact? And so for me, that's why I'm with she, they, is because I'm definitely more feminine than I am masc. And so where I run into some struggles is, and I'm happy with people as long as they're not using he, I am happy, is basically where I sit. Is I'll have a lot of she, but not a lot of they that gets thrown there, which is fine because I do use both pronouns. But when thinking about the advocacy role and meeting with legislators and stuff, it can be really confusing for them to think like, especially in a red state, that people would like transition. And so for them, trying to understand trans people, first of all, because I am trans and I'm non-binary, there's that struggle to then try to break the binary as well. And so that's always an interesting conversation to have when I'm meeting with people, because we've grown up, we are socialized. And this is also just kind of how the human brain works too, is to put people or things into boxes. And when that gets messed up or changed a little bit, messed up's in quotations, of course, that causes confusion. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of my experience with it, is trying to discern from, okay, now you're like transitioning, you do these pronouns, but there's also the challenge with the binary as well.
For me, relatable. Anybody else want to tackle that one?
I can.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think two-spirit, I think a lot of non-native people hear two-spirit or like hear a little bit of a definition about it and start to lean to like, that really resonates with me. Like I would like to identify that, and don't necessarily realize that there is like there are cultural ties to this identity, that like while it's an overarching term that like we as Indigenous people decided for ourselves to kind of unite us as Indigenous communities across the country. All of our like people's individual cultures like have significant roles that like tie into this identity. Like it's not just a thing that sounds cool. It has like a cultural and like spiritual and like typically some kind of role that is important to all of these like 500 plus cultures have like a version of this. of this identity that like it comes with a whole other thing, and if you're not attached to that thing, like it's not for non-native people. And I think people sometimes get a little like miffed about that, like when like people don't like to be told no, like no, you can't touch this, but like in including it in the acronym of like LGBTQIA2S plus etc., like not all Two-Spirit identify with the LGBTQ community, but many do. And so including it is nice, but I think it sometimes comes at the expense of people thinking like that it's up for grabs, basically, when it's like not.
I'd like the MC Hammer in there. Can't touch this.
Yeah. You can look, but you can't have it.
And that kind of underlines exactly how old I am.
Yeah, it's like that's to say it's not the only like more exclusive term. Like there are plenty of labels within the LGBTQIA2S plus umbrella of identities that like have specific meanings. Like stud is not for everybody, and not everyone gets to use this as like an identity, and that's okay. So yeah, that's my main thing, I guess, that I would set the record straight on.
I want to ask one follow-up in there, because you had said 500 different versions of this across, you know, the continent. So not all tribes have, while all tribes may have a Two-Spirit, they don't all have a similar tradition with it. They all have different flavors.
Yeah, I would say Two-Spirit has, because it is like this overarching term, like some tribes have very specific roles that like have a more direct like line to draw between like this role and this title. Mohegan, for example, doesn't have like this role to this title as like a direct line, but Two-Spirit is meaningful to me in that it has a connection. It identifies me to other Indigenous people, but it also connects me to my culture of like through our language, we don't have like he and she pronouns or like singular like we have one singular pronoun. And like you get the rest from context clues, but like identity through our language is shown that it comes from like your roles and relationships to other people, and not necessarily like the body you're born in. Like your gender is, it comes from the way you interact with your community more than it comes from your physical body. And that's also like Two-Spirit as an identity connected to like myself as an Indigenous person, roots me in like, it reminds me to root myself in my like culture and traditions and like my language and the way like our people see and experience the world, which just is helpful in grounding in a like very colonized patriarchal world.
Thank you for that. That's definitely one of those things I think a lot of us don't understand. So that's cool. I like that. And Bliss.
So I guess, you know, and this hits on some things that both Erie and Cal said, you know, for me, as somebody who can watch from the outside, people, the consistency of people's definition of things, ideas, activities, thoughts, philosophies, etc., as gendered, and just being like, wait, what? As a child, it was confusing. Now I think it gives me some insight. And one of the things I feel like I would love for people to understand is that you can't understand someone else's gender experience because you are so deeply rooted in your own. You just can't. They can explain to you all day, and we're all here to share what we can share. You'll never understand it, but your lack of understanding doesn't invalidate it. And so once you reach the point of saying, there are experiences I can't understand, and whether those are based on, you know, race or ethnicity, or again, age, or having gone through some historic event, or I don't care what it is, but once you reach the point of understanding that there are things that you can't understand, you can just accept. And you can see that when somebody says something and explains their experience, it's not invalidating yours simply by being different. It just is. And when we see each other with curiosity and openness, we can all get to know each other better and actually fight the fights we need to, and maybe be fighting them together rather than trying to make up windmills to battle against.
I like that you described that very well. I even took a note there. I wonder. Let me ask. I want to ask you a follow up on that. So, agender people, like all agender people, you're all the same, right?
Are all women the same? I'm just asking. No, and I know where you're coming from, and absolutely right. All of our, it's important to remember that, like, you know, there's been this growth of language, right? As Cass was mentioning, I think it was around in the 90s where two-spirit became a kind of agreed upon term. It was not a, you know, indigenous term, right? The colonists wiped out traditions, and folks needed to come back together and find a way to language, right? And so there's been this burst of language to try to describe different experiences as each growth has given permission for more growth of language. And as that happens, there are people that it's kind of a generational moment or a developmental moment or whatever, where you find the word that fits your experience, but the experience has always been yours. And so I would say for sure, agender is not at all the same thing for everybody. And when I talk to other agender folks, I find actually a lot of them are sort of trans non-binary agender. And that's a really different experience from mine, right? That's a really different journey. And they'll all describe it differently. And then there are the words that come that to people may sound really similar or seem like they're indicating the same thing, and then they're not. So a lot of my younger clients really identify with gender void. And to an external observer, somebody who's just like not accessing gender flexibility in the same way, they might hear gender void and agender and be like, what's the difference? And I can make up a difference from these conversations and say, like, gender void tends to mean I see what gender is and I don't experience it myself as having it. And I'm like, it took me a really long time to figure out what gender was, and I don't experience it. And that's a slight difference of development and journey. But even so, somebody my exact same age who grew up in the same state and region, whatever, who describes themselves as agender, my suspicion is just like with a man who grew up next to another man in the same rate, that their experiences are going to be in some ways more different than similar.
So we all technically didn't have to grow up in New Jersey to be able to agree that it exists. Even if we don't want to. All right, that's great. Yeah, you touched on colonization and colonialism, and I wanted to talk to that a little bit because I know, Cass, when you were talking about your costuming and stuff like that, and you were talking about working on regalia, and it's funny, when I first started coming into my identity as a very, significantly older adult, middle-aged adult, I was actually Grand Knight in my local Knights of Columbus, which is a odd thing to say out loud on a queer panel, but that was my experience, and I came from a very conservative tradition and a very Roman Catholic tradition, and so working through all that has been an interesting thing. I mean, as Bliss put it, just because you lack an understanding doesn't invalidate it. And, taking that step back and, working through things was a big part of what I had to do. But I know it also means I got to deal with all the bad stuff. And, 2021, I was reading about what was going on at the what was the school, Kamloops, up in Canada, where they found unmarked graves for 215. They appeared to be children, and these were all tied to regional schools where they would put Indian people and try to indoctrinate them into Western culture and away from their own, and where you had thriving communities that had two-spirit people and full cultures in place, and basically tearing that apart and keeping moving kids away from even their own brothers and sisters. Just I don't know how I have a question here someplace. I'm not exactly sure what it is. Maybe you can help me put this into perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely like I went to Catholic school for 7 years. Middle school, high school, same school. And pretty early on in like I was like raised Catholic technically, not like strictly, but like for most of my childhood, like went to church most Sundays. And went to like this Catholic school because it was just like a better schooling option than like the public school. More than because my parents cared about, like by the time I was getting into middle school, we overall as a family unit cared a little less about Catholicism generally. So that wasn't even the driving factor of going there. And pretty early on in my schooling, our theology teachers did a pretty successful job at making that probably one of the least appealing options to believe in. So I kind of tapped out on Catholicism pretty early on, but it definitely, like being there for another 6 years had an influence on me, just like the irony of a native kid and willingly going to Catholic school. But also just like I made it my mission to be like the kid that like, yeah, I'm gonna learn this stuff and I'm gonna learn it well because I'm gonna know it better than the people who are trying to like weaponize it against me. Um, and I think like a lot of people forget the main teaching of like love one another as I have loved you is like kind of the main gag here. And I think so much of modern Catholicism especially has like gotten very tied up in this like rigidity and like have just somehow turned around into like often very hateful like people if you are not what they want or expect, um have like a very violent reaction towards it, which is a historical reaction clearly, um as shown by like these schools, and by the way they've colonized the world. um but like I think that the core of this shouldn't be what it has become for like many of its believers and the people who think that they believe this thing but are like executing it extremely poorly based on like what the actual text says. um which is like just like as a kid especially being very like bothered by that of if you read here you should not be acting the way you are. Like this should not be your primary reaction to difference, basically.
Lindsay, you're muted. You're good.
Thank you for that. Hey, let the record show only the first time I've done it tonight.
Yeah.
This is a new record. Yeah, I was just saw something just today where they were, someone was talking about there's always this push to put the Ten Commandments in the school and not the Beatitudes. And the Beatitudes was something Jesus actually talked about, and the Ten Commandments came down through Moses, who was not Jesus. And so yeah, it's people twist the things to do what they want to do.
Yeah. It's also like being Mohegan is also like we have our own history like with the church. Like we have the Mohegan Church and we built that basically because our options were get kicked out west with everyone else or build a church and learn how to conform. So like that church on like Mohegan Hill is like this representation of what allowed us to stay, and also like became a housing for all kinds of things throughout our history, like including our women's sewing society. Like ended up like our women's sewing society met there, and would basically like, oh, it's just a bunch of women sewing, but made a lot of plans and like political movements, and like planned things like our wigwam festival like years and years and years ago, like organized all of these things, but like under the premise of like, oh, we're just women sewing in a church, like nobody is worried about us. And like it's a church, it's not currently used as a church anymore, but it's like our history is very tied to the existence of this church and like this result of colonization, and the building of this church and our history with like schooling and conformity is also like where a lot of our like that's why we are forced to restore and reclaim so much of our culture and language. Like the only reason we have a language that we have to reclaim and revitalize is because it was taken from us, and it was forced out of us. And that's also what that church represents. Like as much as it's what got us to stay, it also contains like everything we've lost.
I want to take a piece of what you were talking about, and I want to actually bring Erie into the conversation here. Because Cass had talked about learning it, taking all this stuff and learning it well, so that you could, kind of push back against people trying to weaponize things
Yeah.
about your existence. And of the four of us on here right now, that's probably more a part of your day-to-day life than any of us. If you want to talk to that, have you had experiences where you've had to learn some of these things just so that you are prepared to be able to push back, and stand up for your own existence,
Like regarding to religion and stuff like that? Like, is that what you're
and
asking?
legislatively?
Yeah, so I've definitely noticed there's a trend of like this is clearly coming from, and in Kansas, and I'm representing myself. I'm not representing any organization as I say this. Is there is a big tie to the Catholic Church in Kansas for coming against queer and trans rights. And as someone that grew up religious, I grew up in the LCMS, Missouri Synod, Lutheran Church. And as I grew up, I knew that there was some things that I really didn't like, kind of things that Cass was pointing out, was like the whole central like thing I learned from the Bible when I was young was to love one another, to take care of each other, and to accept people that are different. And I was told that all the way through fourth grade. And I was told that while I was fifth through eighth grade, I went to Hope Lutheran Church in school. And they would profess that, but then in religion class would talk about how it was wrong to be queer, or how it was wrong for people to transition and stuff like this. And we would hear this during our confirmation classes too. I went through 2 years of confirmation, and I nearly got myself kicked out because that conversation came up, and I was like, this is wrong. And so it was either be quiet and get confirmed and also have my parents be happy, or get myself in some serious trouble, because church also, I heard a little bit of this in Cass's response too, it also serves as a community. And so for my family, that was very central to our community. My dad was very involved in the church. My Boy Scout troop that I was in was very involved with the church. And so it was really central to our lives, was this church. And so I grew up reading the Bible, right? And right now, I don't identify as religious. I'm trying to figure out what that spiritual connection means to me. And I think part of it is because of that fractured, like the fracturization, I guess, if that's a word, of the teachings and what we're being told. And so for me, when I go up against the legislature, like I don't go and like I don't cite scripture, and I've thought about it of like, should I cite scripture and say, hey, like I'm personally not religious, but I grew up religious and I read the Bible and I'm pretty sure I know it pretty darn well as well. Um, and so it's interesting to see because also in Kansas, we have a lot of really good organizations that are religious that have also been trying to help us. And I want to note that as well, because religion has done a lot of harm and can do a lot of harm, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And so a lot of my friends and a lot of my fellow advocates here in Kansas belong to a church or have a church home, and many of them are trans or queer, and I'm glad that they have that home. Kansas Interfaith Action, for example, is a great example of this in Kansas because they are not one denomination or one religion. They're led by Rabbi Modi Greiber, who's a tremendous person, has been a great mentor. And so I have to like separate that for myself, right? That religion can do good and religion can do harm. The goal isn't to like be opposed to religion. It's how can we work with each other? We're all human, right? But we also have different experiences and need to listen to those experiences, especially when there's history behind that as well. And so for me, when I'm going and trying to connect with legislators, Representative Tobias, he's wonderful, and he leads a church in Topeka that is LGBTQ friendly, and they're starting a shelter for homeless LGBTQ youth. And so for me, I just had to make sure I slow myself down and think about that because other synods of Lutherans are very accepting, and they're talking about this rise in Christian nationalism, and they're calling it out. And so it's interesting to see how there's so many different interpretations of the same book or just different books in general. And there's always been a political connection with the church to government, which I find is quite unfortunate. I wish people could go into their jobs and into their positions and yes, still be informed by their religion, but also still be able to make decisions that allow all people to live together. Because whether we like it or not, we're stuck on this rock hurtling through space together, and we got to figure it out. So I will wrap it up there.
Thank you for that. And Bliss, you have anything to add on this topic?
Well, I think I identified with Erie's sort of recognition of the importance of holding both, the idea that religion can do harm and religion is doing well. And frankly, religion against religion or religion towards religion is sometimes the best way to counteract what's the harm. So as an example of that, at Greater Waterbury Pride, which is my home pride, right? Folks showed up and they were, with their little bullhorn making some nasty messages. And, we first basically covered it up with music, right? And then gradually our supportive pastors, we have 3 churches that are represented at our festival, and people gradually came over and started sharing an inclusive word. And to me, that's interesting. And I mean, that was important, and they're folks I really care about and who mean a lot to me. But for me personally, religion wasn't part of my upbringing because both my parents came from overwhelming, slightly repressive religions and came into parenting saying, we're not doing that. And so I think part of what I often recognize in these conversations is so much of trans and queer culture is us starting from our positions of difficulty, of shared harm. And I kind of always stand forward as the example of what happens when you're just affirmed. Like you're just always affirmed, right? When I was 4 and I was like, I think y'all have this stuff wrong about me. And my parents were like, okay. And my grandparents were like, yeah, and they were like, oh, peace out. Nope, there will be no grandparents for you until you recognize what's happening, right? So, right. And I had that experience. And then growing up, my parents were always of the, oh, you'll understand when you meet a girl or boy, right? Like it was just part of the fabric of conversation that whoever you were, now, of course, it was binary, but is what it is, right? But, it's part of the fabric of conversation. And so the idea of existing in this space of, I have taken on so many other people's from my queer family and my queer community, some of their hurts on religion. And I have to remember that's not my fight. And I need to be looking at it right now from where I am and from what I'm seeing and trying to take the benefit from that. And I will say, actually, very specifically in Connecticut, I have such a crew of people who, as Erie was saying, have like their seats in really safe spiritual community. And it clearly means so much to them. And I think that's a voice we need to bring forward more, the kind of the ways that, right, the spiritual seat matters for everyone, regardless of gender identity, sexuality, identity at large, whatever.
I was gonna
go Erie.
tail off of that because I want to be cognizant of time as well.
We're doing good. We're doing well.
That's a good reminder, Bliss. Thank you. Because I grew up 45 minutes away from the Westboro Baptist Church. So I saw them, unfortunately, all the time growing up because they're based out of Topeka. Now I live even closer to them. And so they come to university. And so it's really our goal to just share who we want to be as people and what our values are. And I think this is a growing number. Like, people don't like hate, and that's becoming less and less popular. Over here in Kansas, if Westboro shows up, one, they're all lawyers, so don't ever try to interact with them because they will find a way to sue you. But we choose not to interact because they don't need our attention. They don't need our time. If they don't want to change or to help themselves, really just be better human beings, then that's their choice. However, it's not we shouldn't give that emotional labor or that mental headspace all the time to them either. I took one of my partners actually up to the Equality House, which is right across the street actually from Westboro. It's painted in rainbow. There's a trans house right next to each other. And we went to go look at the trans house, and we still were able to share some joy. We then promptly kissed in front of Westboro and then left. And so that's how we found a little bit of our joy, was just being ourselves, getting to see these houses. I'm glad to see that there is also sparks of hope as well. So yeah, sorry for the ramble there.
Well, that's all right. There's some there are some great organizations out there. Like I remember Faithful America is one that's been following around that traveling road show all across the country as they've been trying to talk up some of the things like Project 2025 and other stuff. And they've been putting billboards in cities, especially those movable light up ones, and dragging them in front of conventions of people gathered to talk about this stuff, to say, hey, this isn't all all people of faith. And even locally, I know for me, my sanctuary has been the Metropolitan Community Church in Hartford, and I've found community there. And every year on Transgender Day of Remembrance, there is no place I'd rather be than there. That's where because they treat it all like I need to experience, where it's part community and it's not all just the doom and gloom, but it's giving proper respect. And yeah, and there are a lot of places like that around here, and I'm sure you have some down there, but they may be harder to find. Let's see. Here I'll do a fun question. If you had to travel back in time to share one piece of wisdom to your younger self, what would you say?
I think for me,
Here you go, Erie. Go.
Sorry, I was speaking over someone.
No, you did good. I would say first person to raise, you're going first.
Unmuted. Start talking is raising my hand. For me, I would say be kind to myself. Because for me, I've done a lot of reflection of what if I would have came out when I was younger? Like, how would that affected my transition and stuff? And then I knock myself in the head and go, well, that wasn't really an option. So don't be mean to myself for that. Really, I would say be kind to myself. I think the hardest thing for me is really I'm neurodivergent, and so I'm always analyzing how other people are looking at me. Am I doing the correct thing? Or I'm always very hard on myself. And so for me, I would really just tell myself, like, hey, you're gonna make it through this. Please just be kind to yourself in this process. Because I think if I would have done that, I probably would have been more willing to reevaluate like those feelings I had when I was younger, and perhaps would have been a little bit more confident in coming out and going through a process that wasn't as painful as it was, because the time that I came out, had I come out earlier, like it would have been a lot better for me developmentally. And so for me, it's be kind to myself, because I can be really hard on myself.
Fair. Now I'm gonna randomly ask. Bliss, would you like to weigh in on that one?
You know, I heard it and I thought, like, I totally understand this question, and I use this question a lot with folks, and I'm like, right, this is actually, it's another one of those oddities of being affirmed that, like, from this position, like, no, I don't actually have any advice. Like, I got to just be me, and it was great. And like, so like I was trying to think of a good jokey response of just, I'm not funny, sadly, but like I wanted to say something like, buy Apple stock.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's always a good one too.
Right, like I don't know. I think there's my friend Jennifer has a shirt that says, be yourself, others will adjust. And so for me, that's not necessarily advice I needed to give my small self, because my small self didn't actually know another way to be. But that's a piece of advice that I would love out in the world, and knowing that it's easier said than done.
I think it's
Right.
important for people to see that people can have that kind of experience. I mean, I think a lot of people dwell on just non-binary, transgender people in general as, it must have been just some struggle and doom and gloom and all that. And it's not. I mean, everybody experiences moments in their life that are like that, but it's the moments, for me, it wasn't the doom and gloom. It was the moments of joy and gender euphoria that taught me more about who I was and my gender than, moments of dysphoria or negative experiences ever did.
I think I would probably I would spare my younger self the like actually much longer, more confusing journey, and just be like, you're a lesbian. Like that's you're good. Like save my younger self a lot of work and strife.
You could have always said, self shoulder pads are not coming back.
I say, I'm like, literally, this shirt literally has shoulder pads in it.
Oh, does it? That's funny.
Lindsay's foot and Drew's mouth.
Oh, I'm still stuck in MC Hammer, and I don't think you have anything in there that remotely resembles anything from the 80s.
Cool, Jack. Oh, yeah. You're going, is that blinking? Yes, I really like your jacket. I know that's not like pertinent to
Thank you.
I dig it a lot. So,
thank you.
like,
the whole ensemble is really cool. Yeah.
Heck yeah.
All right, let's see. Let me give you one more question, and then we'll see if anybody in the audience has any questions that they want us to answer. When it comes to most feeling who you are, and with your gender and all, what gives you joy? What gives you gender joy?
Funnily enough, actually, that should be a question I can't answer. But I think after the last 5 years of having this conversation about this, I feel like I can, which is, so I received cross-gender socialization, which is something that not that many kids get, actually. And when I recognize in myself now, with the self-awareness I have as an adult, watching myself engage with the world with the confidence that was given to me by being socialized one way, but it's unexpected to come out of me as the way that I'm perceived. And when people accept that and say, particularly, girl socialized and women socialized folk, when they say, oh, I wish I could do that. And I'm like, friend, let me tell you a little secret, because it's right. You have the secret key to things. You're like, no, but I've seen this from both sides, right? and in different ways from other of my trans siblings, but I have seen this from both sides, and it's so interesting to just sit there and be like, especially when they're like a little bit edgy around gender norms, or a little bit not edgy in a good way. I mean, like bordering on transphobic, trying not to be, but I'm not transphobic, but I just have this question. You're like, uh-huh. So when it's those people and you're like, let me tell you something, my friend. I love that. It's really fun. It's really empowering, and it's really the thing that constantly brings me gratitude to my parents.
And it just gave me joy hearing about it. Cass or Erie, dealer's choice.
I love being a lesbian, honestly. Makes me feel very gender euphoric, which is it seems like it should be contradictory. But like gender as lesbian, like lesbian as like a gender indicator also works for me. Like, and like it invites a level of like dissonance or chaos that I enjoy. But I like wearing pieces that are like cultural. Like this is like this bolo tie like is quilled that I made this myself. And wearing like other regalia pieces connects me to myself. I actually need to like work on making a full cohesive regalia like that fits post-op surgery and like actually like represents me now. But like I made my wedding outfit, basically I made like wedding regalia for myself, and that was like one of the most like genderful moments for myself, of just like having that control. But like honestly, cosplay is where I get a lot of gender euphoria too, because I have a lot of control over my perception and over how people look at me and read me, which working in in my tribal community with people who I've grown up with, it's honestly sometimes very difficult because they know me as like, a lot of them still think like it's jarring to them that I work here at all. They're like, aren't you like 12? Because they've watched me grow up. So having them rewrite myself in their brains is like harder. And so cosplay is honestly where I get a lot of genderful like positive reinforcement of my identity and self. Even when I'm cosplaying something like a character who's very feminine, it feels more like drag and performance in a way that feels good.
Awesome. I may have seen some of your handiwork at the basketball game on Sunday because they had
Maybe. Yeah, a lot of my friends and family were dancing.
let's see. I'm gonna ask. Does anybody in the audience have any questions that they'd like to ask? How about well, I'll throw one out here.
I can talk. Oh,
Oh, go ahead.
Talking about the expectation of androgyny, in
Oh, we
relating
had a
to
question that popped up in here that said wanted to talk about wrong assumptions about expecting androgyny from non-binary identities, and that's a cool topic. So we gotta go for it.
Yeah. I think when I first started to unravel my gender, definitely leaned very hard into the like trans mask, what I feel like is often a very common trans mask experience of like, get rid of anything that's like not like button downs, so many button downs. I've actually now cycled back to button downs, but we went very aggressively into button downs, chopped all my hair off, like fully binding, not honestly not as frequently as many people do, but I was very large chested and it was very difficult. But in doing so, like ruined like the tissue so that I didn't like them bound or unbound anymore. And then I was like, well, great. I've done this to myself on accident. But very much feeling like if I want to like feel secure, I have to like lean hard in this direction. And then like realized like 2 or 3 years in, I was like, actually, I like miss braiding my hair. I miss like being able to like look the way I want to when I'm like in regalia. And so like grew my hair out really long, and then I cut it off again during the pandemic because that's where we were all at, I feel. I'm growing it back out. But like I've being like my lesbian identity came after the gender journey, and that honestly helped me kind of figure out like a lot of the layers of my identity and what I am like if I'm going to be perceived as a woman, I would like it to be in relation to being a lesbian. Like I would like for people, just any old random person, if they look at me and they're like, "Oh, that's a lesbian." Like, and if they go to she her me, like at least it's under the label of like that's a queer person. And so it really unlocked a level of like that I feel like I also get with Two Spirit, in that I identify with being like a sister. I've grown up as like, oh, the 4Cs, like the 4 sisters. And like that has been like a huge part of my cultural identity, and like just the way I have like experienced myself in the world is like a sister with other sisters. And like my sisters do like often refer to me as sibling and stuff, but like especially like culturally, I'm like fully okay with like being associated with them as like, oh, we are like sisters. And so lesbian unlocks a bit of that like freedom to not necessarily have to feel like I have to present myself androgynously, because I also don't like the common picture of androgyny also comes with being like honestly very thin and white, and obviously I look very white, but I don't have like the extreme thinness that like the popular version of like androgynous non-binariness often like presents itself as. Like I'm not gonna fit into that the way that society would like me to anyway, and it doesn't feel good at either. So I need like the freedom to stop pressuring myself to fill that mold was good.
I like it. Erie.
I think I'm gonna hop in. I'll be quick. So thinking about this question about assuming or having expectations of someone who's being non-binary to be androgynous, when I think about that, that's the whole antithesis for like being non-binary, at least for my experience, is I am choosing who I get to be. I am choosing how people perceive me, but also how I feel comfortable in myself. And so when we're thinking about those conversations, like all of us have very different like experiences, and also just how we feel in ourselves. Because I take a lot of pride in the fact that I can choose how I get to dress. I get to dress more femme, and now that I'm further along in my transition, I've become more comfortable wearing dresses. Earlier on, I did not, and so it's really just taking the time to get to think about that, is when people start to say, well, just wear, I'm going to jokingly say dysphoria hoodie all day. What am I supposed to wear? Like, what is androgynous? That's going to change from person to person, but also cultures to cultures as well. I'm sorry. I spent 4 years wearing khakis and polos in middle school. If that's what you consider androgynous, you're not going to get me in it, because I hated wearing those. And so, yeah, but that's kind of where I fit with it.
Yeah, of like it triangulates like this binary, like a line binary. It just like creates, now you've just made a triangle point of this is where you got to be on this line. And that's not the point.
The spectrum, like we said, it's going to be different for everyone. But yeah.
Well, last time I looked at a triangle, I kind of thought that was the point.
We're talking like a right angle license.
All right, we got a question, y'all. Ready?
Okay, cool. Sure.
All right.
Did you want to answer that one too, Bliss? Or
Oh, I'm sorry for interrupting.
Put a pin in
No,
this one.
I don't have much to say. Again, right? A lot of the questions are kind of like, well, but I identify with what Ari and Cass both said in terms of like, you're just reproducing, you know, cultural ideals and pushing them on people, and could you stop? And I kind of take pleasure in just not flagging queer at all. And it's not like I'm trying to pass as a thing. It's like, there is no thing which is agender. And I refuse to allow you to believe that your expectation of gender expression is ever going to like decide my identity. So some people are like, your hair is so long. And I'm like, yeah, there was COVID. I didn't want anyone touching my hair. Right? Like to me, these things are really basic. Or like, oh, you're wearing a dress? And I'm like, yeah, it's hot. I think everybody should. Right? Like to me, these things are entirely practical. And the fact again that they get just like constantly gendered. And like I'm not so gender blind that I don't know that long hair and breasts and dresses like indicate feminine to people, right? But I'm like, yeah, but I have long hair and like I'm okay with that. And someday I'll have short hair maybe, and I'm okay with that too. And none of that is gendered. So I don't, again, it's just one of those like, but why? Why are you doing this thing? Anyway, Kim, it sounded like was excited to share.
Well, now we have 3 questions.
I see them. I
We're very
want to
popular.
put one I want to put one capper in this, and then I'm going to read through some of these questions.
Okay.
Which is, I know when I first started coming to my identity, I was like 49 years old and out in the world and established, and it was enough just to recognize my own identity. It wasn't about getting dressed up or anything else like that. It was trying to identify who I was and how I felt. So androgyny is an external expression of who we are. And if somebody wants to dress like that, that's just, that gender expression. It's not gender identity. So you can't look at how somebody's dressed and say, oh, they're non-binary, they're a cis guy, they're a cis girl, they're a lesbian. Well, maybe you can do that with that. I don't know. But
all of my regalia is very lesbian flag colors. So if you know, you know.
These days, I'm just happy if I can get pants with pockets. All right, I'm going to take these in the order that they're in here. I got from Michelle, we have a question. What is the most impactful thing a teacher could do to support students who identify as trans?
I think I'll hop on that real quick because this is a conversation I have with former teachers in the legislature sometimes, as well as just a lot of people in Kansas. The best thing you can do is honestly accept them. And that's why, and there's this debate of, well, should parents be informed? Home is not necessarily safe for that. Had I come out as non-binary in high school and that got reported to my father, like bad things would have happened. I would have not been in a good shape coming to school the next day. But the best thing you can do is, one, if they tell you this in confidence, one, hold that in confidence. They're trusting you as an adult to do that. But two, if they're like going through and want to experiment with their identity in school, the best thing to do is accept them for that and ask, like, okay, who can know this? And if they're open, use those pronouns, use that preferred name, because that is tied to your identity. It's tied to their identity, saying, when you do that, you're saying, I value you and I care about you as a person. And it shows that you care. And so for me, that's the most important thing you can do. Your response should not be, well, do your parents know? Or I'm gonna go tell your parents, or are you sure? Like, generally the person who's going to be most sure about themselves is themselves. So yeah.
I would love to follow that on as, again, somebody who got to go to school in an affirming way, because I had parents who were sick of conformist shit, frankly. And right, I mean, literally, my parents were born in the 40s and 50s, and they went through kind of the 60s, and they were like, we want to create our kids for the world we want to create in anti-war protests, civil rights movement, right? And that was really their philosophy going in. And what they needed us to be able to do in order to support that world and not become just one more form of, again, of conformity, was to make sure that we could think independently, think creatively, and move forward in a way that was kind, practical, and aware of community, right? So what my parents asked of my school was very simple, right? Of course, for my generation, honestly, pronouns like weren't really a thing. Like I gathered my pronouns much later. I saw them one day. I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense, right? And moved on. But I was already an adult by then, right? Pronouns were never the big thing for me, but they echoing Erie, for sure, use those pronouns in school, as long as you're making sure you use them in front of the people that the children are okay with you using them in front of. But like, for me, it was, don't question them, right? Like, and so like, you know, oh, I'm going to be on the kickball team. Okay. Right. Like, I'm gonna now go do X or Y activity, and maybe you didn't expect it. And like, who cares? Literally, what you think doesn't matter. You need to get out of your gendered space. And I think that's part of like, Erie, when you responded with, oh, really? Or are you sure? Part of that is, it's that immediate stuckness in, you look this way, so you should do X, Y, and Z things without your conscious consideration. And so to me, giving the active, when a kid says they want to do X, and I don't mean transition, when they want to do whatever activity or color their frog, however they want to color their frog, if it isn't harming anyone, let them. And that reinforces all identities. Also, I will add, all teachers should wear pronoun pins and should put their name and pronouns on the board, because pronouns should be normalized. And when a kid comes out as trans or is in the process of transition, normalize it, i.e., don't make them the focus of attention as the one token trans kid, right? Like, just let them be them, and they are engaging in the world as a trans kid, and they're just doing their thing.
Good advice, with one caveat on the mandating pronouns, because there are people out there that aren't out and are non-binary, and not everybody wants to be confronted with having to put that in public display and be in a position where they either have to come out and say what their pronouns are or lie about them. So just, you know, if you can do it and model that behavior yourself, as Bliss said, that is really super powerful. Just be careful of mandating it, because there are these other things that are at play in there.
No, I didn't suggest that anybody ask students to give their pronouns. Teachers
No, I didn't want anybody to extrapolate. I didn't want anybody
yeah.
to extrapolate that from what you said. So I figured anybody would just
For
come
sure.
right out and say it.
For sure.
They had somebody on here just because I'm going to take this one out of queue just because it goes along with our last conversation. Someone who identifies as non-binary, should I ask them each time I see them what name or pronoun I should use for them? Gary?
I'm like, I don't want to keep like taking every single question.
Oh, yeah, all yours.
I have a couple friends, and it really is going to depend on the person. So I would also ask, like, hey, is there a pronoun like you would like me to use to default? And if they're gender fluid, like how we do it, and it's different with different friends, but one of my friends is gender fluid, and so different days they'll feel a little bit different. And so generally, like their rule, and this is just their rule, is default to they them, but if you want to like check, just feel free to ask. So when in doubt, like, feel free to ask what each person feels. I know that's like a very, like, it can be like a lot to remember to go through that process, but time makes that easier as well. Just remember, if you have a question about it, feel free to ask. Because like my friend, and I'm stopping myself from saying their name, on a lot of days, they're like, actually, I think I just want to use they, them today. And so they're not sitting on using he or she. And so it's a very personal journey. It's going to be different from everyone. So when in doubt, ask. If you ask and you're trying to just be helpful, people can tell. And so if you're asking, just, hey, do you want me to do those check-ins? And if they're like, yeah, cool. Or if they say just default to they, them, then that's also a possibility as well.
We didn't have a gender fluid person on this panel, but if you were dealing with someone that's gender fluid, identity underneath non-binary, you might want to do that with them, because they're more likely to have that. I don't want to speak for everybody in the panel, and you can slap me if I am, but I think all four of us really, while being non-binary, are the way we experience gender is relatively fixed. Is that a true statement? Because I definitely don't want to speak for people. But there are definitely identities where it's not as fixed. And early on, it's not as fixed for people too. And I know I experimented with pronouns, as I got comfortable with that in, group settings, support group settings. let's see, I'm going to just read this one. It says, I wanted to say this is Jacorbo. Did I slaughter that name or was I close?
Just call them Jack.
Jack. I wanted to say I love Iridescent's name and nickname, and Bliss knows I love her name also because we're buds. And Cass and Lindsay is great, not necessarily gendered name also. Do any of you want to speak to choosing or keeping an androgynous name?
So I was Cassandra, and grew up with like a different nickname and went to college, and was like done with being Cassie. I was like, that's not for me. I'm gonna go into college with Cassandra. And I like people just love to give people nicknames and want to hack it down and like want to shorten it. And I just like did not like Cassie anymore. And so like a few people shortened it instead of to Cass. I was like, Cass is fine, if you want to shorten it. But a few people, like just one too many, tried to shorten it to Cassie, and I was like, all right, we're done here. And like that was like on the same pipeline of me like coming into like myself as like a like non-binary person and like identifying with they them, and I was like, great, well, we're just gonna chop it, to Cass. And that just continued to resonate. Like I do like Cass. So it really for me came from just hacking off the name I was given. And when I got married, I just like added that in as like the freebie name change. I was like, great, we'll just make that hack official. Because I have a lot of fondness for my like assigned name at birth, but like we're just not her anymore.
I can relate to that. Anybody else have a thought on that? Because that was a great answer. Go ahead.
I guess I'll follow up. So I've actually been going by Erie in Spaces since 2017. And it's kind of a funny story when people ask me how I chose my name, because I'm like, well, originally it was one of my friends. We hung out on Discord a lot and we played a lot of games and we got to really know each other. And they said, I'm bad with names, so I'm going to come up with nicknames. And for some reason, mine was Iridescent. And they said it's because they were explaining oil and how I'm also bubbly and I'm just different from all points of view according to them. And so I don't know, I found the name cute, and I really, when I was coming out, was like, do I want to use that, do I not? Because it really resonated to me, and I was like, I actually really like this nickname. And so I've been going by Erie for years, like years before I even came out too. And so when I was coming out, I was like, I think I want to do this one because it has that historical and personal connection for me. And yeah, so that's how I kind of chose it. It was kind of like a nickname that was originally chosen for me. And so I tested it through D&D campaigns of all things. I named my character Iridescent before I had like started using that. Fortunately, our session, like we only went like 5 sessions and then stopped, which is typical for D&D. But I realized I really liked going by that name. And so yeah, that's how I kind of got mine. And I've just also naturally been responding to Erie for years, so it just made sense for me.
Excellent. Just in the interest of getting through these other questions, I'm just going to move on to these. I got, how can I help the community I work with, predominantly older Black Americans, want to learn more about new language and identities?
That is a question that I honestly contend with in my workplace all the time. For my own community of just working on like how to find the language to explain this in a way that like actually resonates with the person you're talking to. Because anyone who's tried to explain like why you should respect trans people, even if you don't understand it, like knows that it's not as simple as like if you're speaking to a cis man to be like, well, what if someone just started she, herring you all day? Like that's not a thing that happens to this person. And so like it doesn't mean anything really. Like they're like, well, it wouldn't bother me because obviously I'm this. Like that's usually the response I've gotten in that kind of instance. And so I've like worked on finding the thing that makes it click for people, of like, when you don't try to use my pronouns, like, and try to respect this thing you don't fully understand, like, it's hurtful to me. Trying to get someone to understand that is like sometimes unreasonably difficult. But for me and my community, a lot of us look rather white because we've been here and have been under the influence of colonization for a long time. A lot of us look very white. And so for my community, I've found it to be rather successful to get the point across by saying, like, when you're somewhere with non-native people and they learn you're native and start asking like, well, you don't look very native, or even when like you're around non-native people who don't realize you're native and they start saying things that are like microaggressions or even just straight up like racist, and you don't know, you're in that weird zone where you're like, I don't know if I feel empowered right now to say something and correct. That feeling that makes you feel so icky and weird and like insecure in yourself and like tight in your body, that's how it feels when you don't make an attempt to like try to do this thing, for me. And that's where I've found the most successful thing, is like finding an analogy that meets the person where they're at.
So
I know when
I
I
would
talk with medical personnel sometimes, and I'll be in a room talking about this, and it'll be like, you know, or any of the women in here, have you ever been standing there next to a guy and had somebody else come up and ask a question, and presuming that the guy that was a nurse that was standing next to you was the doctor and that you were the nurse? And you know, there's just every single hand in the room always goes up, and it's like, and how did that feel? That's how a lot of this, you know, this stuff can be, you know, take it completely out of the context of gender. So
So
I
I
guess
do.
that was a good example. Go ahead,
Sorry,
Bliss.
Lindsay.
No, go ahead.
Now that there's thunder, I think my Zoom is slowing down, so I'm having that delay. I'm so sorry. The I actually do corporate trainings on gender awareness for kind of DEI, and one of the ways that and it won't work for all communities, right? And each, because as Cass and Lindsay are pointing out, like each group of people have their own sensitive points that will allow for those openings of understanding, and that's just essentials, understanding what those points of entry and awareness are. But I will say that the way that I actually do gender trainings is a little bit different from a lot of them. It's not a, let me show you PowerPoint and walk you through. As I always say, it's 2024. You can Google your pronouns. Your HR doesn't need to pay me $100 an hour to do it, right? Like, it's not about fact, it's about impact, as Casserly pointed out, and as Lindsay, like, what makes you feel that way? And so the way I actually run them is almost as encounter groups, asking people to reflect on their own gender, because most people have never been given the opportunity, and they exist in the world where it is so themselves, they can't imagine a world outside of it. And that's a thing I've been saying in a number of different ways throughout this presentation. But I actually find that for some people, when you ask them to stop and go back and consider their experiences of gender and developmental moments, and then once they're really in that moment, asking them to think, how would you have known if you were different? Or, you know, some of those more like insight-oriented questions. That's been really effective in a group scenario to start to just open up that curiosity of self and of other that comes from a place of love and community, rather than a place of difference and labeling and just needing to put in boxes.
Thank you, Bliss. One last question here, and then we're going to move on to if any of our panelists have any closing statements. Are your healthcare providers accepting and knowledgeable about the spectrum of identities as discussed tonight?
I think mine are somewhat educated about it. They like try to be conscientious about pronouns and like have a space on the sheet to write them. don't always successfully use them. Like wrote a letter for me the other day to like clear me from COVID to go back to work basically, and like use the wrong pronouns. And I think that it was just not my normal doctor and like missed the note on my file or whatever. Not a big deal, but like in person I'd say they put a little more effort into it than like purely digital. But I did my top surgery like fully solo. I went to Turkey, like in Istanbul for mine. So it was like completely separate from my healthcare providers here. And honestly, that was overall a very like affirming experience over there, even with like a language barrier. But here I would say mine, not the like certainly not like the worst, but could be better. There's room for improvement.
Not to say I have like similar experiences. If I'm in person, like they're very intentional about it. I'll just say like my gender affirming care doctors that I go to, they're all very like cognizant of that one. My general practitioner sometimes does mess up, but is like, trying. So I do have that range. And then there's my dentist office where they have my preferred name on file, but they'll send everything like any text notifications or emails and stuff in my dead name, and then will still address me by my dead name until we get to like the people who are actually interacting with me. And so for me, like the dental hygienists are very, very cognizant of that. And then depending on my doctor, like they generally try. And sometimes they do mess it up and they'll say sorry. But like overall, I think because and when we look at the overwhelming like amount of evidence that respecting and honoring someone's like gender identity is really important, like all these studies that we see from the medical community, I think for a majority for me, there's definitely like the movement of trying if they aren't adjusting, but I feel like overall I've had even in Kansas like a pretty decent experience.
Any more? Are we excellent. Well, thank you all for your participation in this. I'm going to move over to closing comments. If anybody has wants to take a minute or two to give your last thoughts on the panel or the experience or and what topic that came up tonight, the floor is yours.
I would actually love to pop in there and ask something of the audience and just say first, like, I'm so glad that y'all are here and thank you for being here, whatever, wherever you land on this gender spectrum. And I'm getting the sense from the questions that a lot of folks are coming from a very different perspective and are here and taking time to really understand something different. And I appreciate that so much. And if you have the bandwidth, we would love it if you would drop into the Q&A just a number like between 1 and 5. Did you get something out of this today? One is like, I didn't hop off because I didn't want to be rude. But and like 5 is like, no, I really got something out of this, because that helps us. And if you want to just add on a quick, what you learned or what you wanted to learn that you didn't get out of it, any information and feedback that we can have, because both Lindsay and I work in worlds where we're trying to forward some of this, and we have institutional backing behind us in different ways. As is Erie, she's just off in a different state, right? So, so any of this is really interesting for us. So I would appreciate any feedback in the Q&A or the chat if you can access it. But I think you can just access the Q&A.
I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you. Erie or Cass?
I don't think I have much to add. Thank you for having me. But yeah, I think reflecting on your gender, regardless of where you currently like lay on the spectrum or like think you identify with like strongly right now, I think it's always helpful to reflect on what it is about your gender or lack of that like speaks to you. Like I think that's important for everyone to do. I think that cis people especially should do it. I think it would help the world a lot if they also thought about what about their gender identity is important to them. Like what is important to you about identifying this way, and like what empowers you in this identity.
Lastly, kind of like everyone else, I want to say thank you for being here. And I know this has kind of been a theme, right, that we've noted of it being a spectrum and all of us having different experiences. It's going to be the same for you, regardless of whether you're questioning your gender or not. And I think the most important thing is thank you for coming here. You don't have to have like non-binary or trans people like understood or like, because I'm still learning new things, right? And I'm non-binary, I'm trans. But the thing is that you care about someone compassionately as another human being. And so I think if you're in that mindset, everything's going to be great. You might not get everything figured out right now, and that's not the point. The point is you're trying to make the world a better, more equitable and just place, and helping people feel comfortable in just being themselves. And so having questions and not understanding, like, don't feel bad about that, because I am also still very much on a learning journey, and I feel like I learn more stuff every day, and I live this identity every day, and I work with a lot of queer and trans students. So yeah.
Well, thank you all. I'm so thrilled that all of you decided to join us here tonight. This was a good conversation, and I'm glad that we could do this.
Someone's got a fashion comment. Cass, can we see the bolo tie?
Oh,
Yes. Here we go. It's a quill
oh,
work.
neat.
Yeah, so it's all porcupine quills on birch bark.
Is that like a cardinal?
Yes.
That is really
That's awesome.
Thank you.
But yeah, we would love to do more of these in the future, and with some more identities. We chose to kind of limit it to 3 because you start having 5, 6 people, and it just it starts getting, you get to
That'll
cover
be
a
a
lot
rather
less
long
ground,
file.
and it stays a little more superficial. This was intentional to keep this size, but there's absolutely an intention to do this again. If you look out on the New Haven Pride Center's YouTube page, there are 2 other non-binary panels that I've done called Beyond the Binary, and you will have some additional identities on those, so feel free to reach out and give those a listen, and a plug for the New Haven Pride Center, who does awesome work in the community. So with that, I think we're gonna log off here and call this an evening. Thank you all for attending. So glad you've all been here. Support your local PFLAG, support OurTransLife in down in Bridgeport. Come down to Mohegan and check out the Mohegan Sun and all of the cultural stuff that's down there in that Mohegan area. And thank you all.
Thank you.